At my father's retirement party, he stood in front of 200 elite guests and introduced me by saying, "This is my daughter. She has no degree and no future, and just freeloads off the family name." The entire room erupted in uncomfortable laughter. I did not flinch or cry. I just smiled, lifted my glass, and gave a toast they would never forget before walking out. What they did not know was that the receipt I left behind would turn their arrogance into pure terror. My name is Kira. I am 33 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family treated me like a burden. While they paraded around their high society circles in Connecticut, I was the designated disappointment. I had dropped out of college years ago, a decision my father Harrison never let me forget. He was the chief executive officer of a traditional wealth management firm, and he valued only two things in life: degrees and money. My older brother Derek was his golden boy, armed with an Ivy League education and a massive ego. My mother Susan was a woman who cared only about appearances and country club gossip. They all believed I was a failure, struggling to survive. They were entirely wrong. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar financial technology empire. I had built Aegis Financial Tech from the ground up, but I kept my success a heavily guarded secret. I wanted to see how they would treat me when they thought I had nothing. The grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club was suffocatingly opulent. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over round tables draped in white silk. 200 of the most influential people in the state were gathered to celebrate my father's announced retirement, scheduled to take effect after a 6-month transition, during which he would remain chief executive officer and controlling shareholder. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted duck. I sat at the main family table near the front of the stage. I wore a simple but sharply tailored black suit. It was a custom designer piece, but without any loud logos, my family assumed it was some cheap outfit from a discount store. I sat quietly, sipping sparkling water, while the people around me shared stories of summer homes and stock portfolios. No one spoke to me. I was simply the awkward backdrop to my family's shining perfection. The clinking of silverware stopped when my father walked up to the microphone. He looked incredibly proud of himself in his expensive tuxedo. He spent the first 10 minutes of his speech recounting his brilliant career and thanking his wealthy friends for their support. Then he turned his attention to my brother. Derek stood up and waved to the crowd while my father praised his recent promotion. My father told everyone that Derek was the future of the firm, a true financial genius who would take the family legacy to new heights. The guests clapped loudly. Derek soaked up the applause with a smug grin. Then my father looked down at our table, his eyes locked onto me. A cruel spark ignited in his gaze. He decided that praising his son was not enough. He needed to elevate Derek by stepping on me. My father leaned into the microphone. He gestured toward me with his free hand. "And then we have Kira," he announced, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "She is still trying to figure out what to do after dropping out of college to play with computers. I suppose we cannot all be winners. Some people just prefer to take the easy road and coast on the family name." The room went dead silent for a fraction of a second before a wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. It was that polite, condescending laughter of rich people pretending a cruel insult was just a charming family joke. Hundreds of eyes turned to stare at me. I could feel their pity and their judgment pressing down on my shoulders. In the past, a moment like this would have broken me. I would have run to the bathroom crying, but tonight I felt absolutely nothing. I just sat there, looking back at my father with a blank expression. Beside me, my mother Susan leaned over. She smelled strongly of floral perfume and expensive wine. She did not offer me any comfort. Instead, she adjusted her diamond necklace and whispered in my ear, You brought this on yourself, Kira. If you had just listened to us and married that nice investment banker 3 years ago, you would not be such an embarrassment. Now you just sit there and ruin the aesthetic of the evening. Try to look a little less miserable. People are staring. I slowly turned my head to look at her. I did not argue. I just picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. My silence seemed to irritate her even more. She scoffed and turned her attention back to the stage, where my father was wrapping up his speech to thunderous applause. When my father returned to the table, the guests began eating their main courses. The tension at our table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek walked over from his seat on the other side of my mother. He was holding a leather booklet. It was the catering bill for the entire event. My father had insisted on paying for the venue and the food to show off his wealth. Derek casually tossed the leather booklet onto my plate, right on top of my untouched food. It made a heavy slapping sound against the porcelain. I looked down at the booklet and then up at my brother. Dad said since you are eating the caviar, you can finally make yourself useful. Derek sneered quietly, so the other tables would not hear. He told me to have you handle the tip for the waiting staff. Consider it your rent for living off the family reputation all these years. Just try not to bounce a check. It might be a little out of your budget. I slowly opened the leather booklet. The total bill for the night was $15,000. The required tip would be substantial. Derek stood there waiting for me to panic. He wanted me to flush with embarrassment to admit I did not have the money and to beg for their forgiveness. My father was watching from the corner of his eye, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. They wanted to break my spirit completely. Instead of reacting with fear, I felt a deep sense of clarity. This was the defining moment. This was the absolute end of my tolerance for their abuse. I closed the leather booklet. I picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water and stood up from my chair. The movement caught the attention of the surrounding tables. My father frowned, clearly annoyed that I was drawing attention to myself. "What are you doing?" he hissed at me. "Sit down and stop making a scene." I ignored him. I raised my glass high enough for the people at the nearby tables to notice. "Cheers to Harrison," I said, my voice carrying a quiet but absolute authority. "I am so glad I came tonight, because this is the last time any of you will ever see me." The smirk wiped off my father's face. My mother gasped softly. Derek stepped forward, his face turning red with sudden anger. He reached out and grabbed my arm in a tight grip. He tried to pull me back down into my chair. "What is wrong with you?" Derek whispered harshly. "You do not get to storm out of here and embarrass us. You are a nobody. Now sit down before Dad cuts you out of the will completely." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. Then I looked him dead in the eyes. My gaze was so cold and hollow that he instinctively loosened his grip. I pulled my arm away and smoothed out the sleeve of my jacket. "Keep your inheritance," I said softly. "You are going to need it much more than I will." I picked up the leather billing booklet from the table. I turned my back on my family and walked away. I could feel their furious glares burning into my back as I crossed the ballroom floor. I walked straight to the reception area near the main entrance. The maitre d' was standing behind a mahogany podium looking over the guest list. I placed the leather booklet on his podium. He opened it and looked at me with a polite but questioning expression. "I need to settle this bill for the Harrison table," I told him. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket. I bypassed my personal debit cards and pulled out a solid black corporate Centurion card. The card was heavy, made of anodized titanium. It was a financial instrument issued exclusively to ultra-high net worth entities. I handed it to the maitre d'. "Please charge the full $15,000 to this card," I instructed him, "and add a $5,000 tip for your staff." You all did a wonderful job tonight." The maitre d' looked at the card. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized what it was. He processed the payment quickly and respectfully handed me the receipt to sign. I signed my name with a swift stroke of a pen. I handed the pen back and walked out the front doors of the country club. The crisp night air felt amazing against my skin. A sleek, black private town car pulled up to the curb. My driver opened the door for me and I stepped inside, leaving my toxic family behind forever. Back inside the grand ballroom, the maitre d' walked over to my family's table. He placed the signed receipt and the closed leather booklet down in front of my father. "Your bill has been completely settled by the young lady," the maitre d' said with a polite bow. "And she left a very generous tip. Have a wonderful evening." My father and Derek exchanged a confused look. Derek snatched the leather booklet and opened it. He pulled out the receipt to see how a broke college dropout could possibly pay such a massive bill. My father leaned over his shoulder to look. Their eyes landed on the printed information at the top of the receipt. The payment was not registered to my personal name. It was registered to Aegis Financial Tech Holdings, the largest and most ruthless financial technology empire in the country. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Their smug smiles vanished instantly as they stared at the paper. They had no idea what was coming for them next. I learned what happened at the family table only later. After Derek accused me of using a stolen corporate card, the maitre d' contacted the verification number on the back of the card. Aegis Security confirmed the charge and requested a written incident report from the club. Felix forwarded that report to me the next morning. According to the maitre d', the music continued inside the ballroom, but the silence around my family was absolute. Harrison stared at the receipt, as if the printed name belonged to another language. Derek held it beneath the chandelier, insisting that there was no possible way I had legitimate access to an Aegis corporate account. He suggested that I must have taken the card from an executive while working as a low-level assistant, and warned that any arrest for fraud could damage the Harrison name. Even confronted with evidence that their assumptions might be wrong, their first instinct was not concern for me. It was fear for their reputation. The report continued with Harrison ordering Derek to locate me and determine how I had obtained the card. He told him to search public records, trace my address, and protect the family from whatever scandal they imagined I had created. Susan sat twisting her diamond ring, confused by the company name but alarmed by the panic spreading across the table. Derek immediately began running searches on his phone. The details matched the security alerts Felix had already received from our identity monitoring system. My family was terrified, but not because they thought I might be in danger. They were terrified that the daughter they had mocked could expose them to public embarrassment. Their reaction confirmed exactly why the dummy address in Queens was necessary. Meanwhile, I was sitting in the back of my private town car, watching the wealthy suburbs of Connecticut fade into the distance. The plush leather seats and the quiet hum of the engine provided a stark contrast to the suffocating environment I had just escaped. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the minibar and took a deep breath. For the first time in my life, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety. Paying that massive catering bill was not just about showing off. It was a calculated message. It was a direct response to decades of being treated like a financial parasite by the very people who were supposed to support me. As the car merged onto the highway toward New York, I let my mind drift back to the reality of my action-based backstory. They loved to call me a burden, but the truth was far more sinister. When I was 19 years old, Derek had secretly taken out 2 credit cards in my name. He maxed them out to fund a reckless spring break trip with his fraternity brothers. When the collection agencies started calling me, I was terrified and went to my father for help. Instead of holding Derek accountable, my father told me to grow up and pay my own debts. He said it was a good lesson in financial responsibility. I had to work double shifts at a local diner just to pay off the interest, while Derek drove around in a brand new sports car my father bought him as a graduation present. When I was 21, I asked my father to co-sign a modest student loan so I could finish my degree. I had a brilliant idea for a predictive financial algorithm and just needed one more year of classes to perfect my coding skills. My father laughed in my face. He called my project worthless garbage and refused to sign the papers. He told me I lacked the intellectual capacity to understand business. That was the day I dropped out of college. I realized that staying in their world meant I would always be suffocated by their arrogance. I took the few $100s I had left, moved to a tiny apartment in the city, and taught myself how to build the algorithm that would eventually become the foundation of Aegis Financial Tech. They threw me to the wolves, and I came back leading the pack. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a secure number. The line rang twice before my chief operating officer answered. Felix was the most loyal and intelligent person I had ever met in the corporate world. We had built Aegis together, and he knew exactly how toxic my family was. "The opening move is complete," I told him, watching the city skyline come into view. I paid the catering bill with the corporate card. They saw the holding company name. They are going to start digging. "Excellent work, Madam CEO," Felix replied, his voice calm and professional. "I have already instructed our security team to monitor any inquiries into your personal details. As expected, your brother has just attempted to access your credit history and public residency records. Our firewalls are holding strong. He will only find the information we want him to find." "Did you prepare the dummy apartment?" I asked. "Yes," Felix confirmed. "The lease is registered under a shell corporation but loosely tied to your name. The address is a rundown studio in Queens. It is staged perfectly to look like the home of a struggling college dropout. He will assume you are living in poverty and making terrible decisions." "Perfect," I said. "Keep me updated on his movements. I want to know the second he starts heading toward that address." I ended the call and instructed my driver to take me to the location in Queens instead of my actual penthouse in Manhattan. I needed to be ready. I knew Derek. I knew his impatience and his aggressive nature. He would not wait long to confront me. He needed to feel superior, and he needed to assert dominance. The town car pulled up to a dingy brick building on a noisy street corner. The streetlights flickered, and the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. It was the exact opposite of the luxurious life I actually lived. I thanked my driver and stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk. I unlocked the heavy metal door and walked up 3 flights of narrow stairs to the studio apartment. Felix had done an incredible job staging the place. There was a cheap futon in the corner, a wobbly desk covered in scattered papers, and a refrigerator stocked with cheap instant meals. I took off my tailored designer jacket and draped it over a plastic chair. I sat down on the futon and opened my laptop. For the next 3 days, I lived a double life. During the day, I would conduct multi-million-dollar acquisition meetings from my secure laptop, ensuring that Aegis Financial Tech continued to dominate the market. I finalized mergers, approved massive resource allocations, and directed my global teams with absolute authority. But in the evenings, I stayed in that cramped studio apartment, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door. I knew my family was scrambling. The financial markets were shifting, and Harrison Wealth Management was quietly bleeding capital. My father was desperate to maintain his wealthy facade, while his firm secretly crumbled under the weight of Derek's terrible investment choices. They needed a scapegoat, and they needed a lifeline. On the morning of the 4th day, my phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Felix. "Your brother is currently parking his car 3 blocks away from the studio. He is approaching the building on foot. He looks highly agitated." I closed my executive dashboard and opened a random text document, making it look like I was struggling with basic data entry. I messed up my hair slightly and put on a faded, oversized sweater. I wanted to look exactly like the failure they always claimed I was. I sat at the wobbly desk and stared at the screen. The tension in the air was electric. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding up the narrow staircase outside the apartment door. They were loud and aggressive. Derek did not care who heard him. He reached the third-floor landing and marched straight to my door. He did not knock politely. He pounded his fist against the cheap wood, making the entire frame rattle. I took a deep breath, letting the familiar feeling of their hostility wash over me. But this time it did not hurt. It only fueled my determination. I stood up and walked slowly to the door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches, keeping the chain attached. Derek was standing in the hallway, sweating through his expensive tailored suit. His face was red, and his eyes darted around the dingy hallway with obvious disgust. He looked at me and sneered. His expression was a mixture of triumph and panic. He thought he had caught me hiding in my miserable reality. He thought he still had all the power.
"Open the door, Kira," Derek demanded, pushing his hand against the wood. "We need to talk right now. You have caused a massive problem for this family, and I am here to clean up your mess."
I kept my face perfectly blank. I looked at his sweating forehead and his shaking hands. He was trying to project authority, but I could smell the sheer desperation radiating off him. He was about to demand something impossible, and he was going to use every manipulative tactic in his arsenal to get it. I reached up and unhooked the metal chain, letting the door swing open. I stepped back into the cramped studio apartment and gestured for him to enter. He walked inside, looking around at the cheap furniture with a look of absolute revulsion. He had walked right into my trap. The real game was finally about to begin. Derek wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. The humid summer air of the city had clearly taken a toll on him, but the sweat beating at his temples told a different story entirely. It was the cold, frantic sweat of a man who was running out of time. He looked around the cramped studio apartment, his nose wrinkling in disgust at the sight of the cheap futon and the peeling linoleum floor. He carefully kept his arms tucked close to his sides, avoiding letting his tailored suit brush against the walls, as if poverty was a disease he might catch.
"This place is a complete dump, Kira," he said, shaking his head slowly.
"I cannot believe you actually live like this. Dad was right all along. You threw away a perfectly good life just to end up living in absolute squalor." I closed the heavy metal door behind him and leaned against the cheap wood. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep a smile from forming on my face. The fact that he bought the illusion so easily just proved how little he actually knew me. My family had always assumed my lack of a college degree equaled a lack of intelligence. I crossed my arms over my faded sweater and stared at him playing the part of the defeated sister to absolute perfection. "Why are you here, Derek?" I asked, keeping my voice low and defensive. "You have never visited me once in the last 10 years. You do not just show up in Queens on a Thursday afternoon to critique my interior design." He sighed heavily, trying to adopt a tone of brotherly concern. It looked incredibly unnatural on him. He unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a sleek leather folder, tossing it onto my wobbly desk. It landed with a soft thud right next to a stack of fake utility bills Felix had planted there the day before. "I am here because I am trying to save you from yourself," Derek said smoothly, adjusting his expensive tie. "And because the family needs a small favor from you. A minor technicality, really." "What kind of technicality?" I asked, walking slowly over to the desk, but deliberately not touching the folder. Derek began to pace the narrow length of the room. He explained that Harrison Wealth Management was going through what he called a minor restructuring phase. He threw out a barrage of corporate buzzwords to try and confuse me. He talked about liquidity optimization, bridge financing, and temporary asset reallocation. If I had actually been the uneducated dropout they all thought I was, I might have been intimidated by the heavy jargon. But as the chief executive officer of Aegis Financial Tech, I translated his corporate spin instantly. The firm was completely broke. They had over-leveraged their assets, made terrible speculative trades, and were currently drowning in toxic debt. "We have a routine audit coming up next month," Derek continued, his voice tightening slightly as he paced. "It is just standard protocol, but we need to show a bit more liquid capital on our balance sheets to keep the regulators happy. I have arranged a short-term bridge loan to cover the gap. I just need you to sign these papers." I looked at the leather folder and then back at his sweating face. "If the firm needs a loan, why do you need my signature? Dad is the chief executive officer. He has access to millions of dollars in personal assets." Derek stopped pacing and wiped his forehead again. The charming, confident facade was starting to crack under the slightest bit of pressure. "Dad is currently wrapped up in other investment vehicles," he lied smoothly. "His assets are tied up in ways that make it complicated to secure this specific type of fast funding. We need clean, unencumbered collateral. That is where you come in." He stepped toward the desk and pointed to the dark leather folder. "Grandma left you that small inheritance trust when she passed away. It is not much, just a couple $100,000, but it has been sitting in an account gathering dust because you never bothered to claim it. The bank is willing to issue the bridge loan if we use your trust as collateral. It is perfectly safe, Kira. The firm will pay off the loan in 6 months, and you will get your little trust fund back completely untouched." I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. Grandma had left me that trust explicitly for my education, or a down payment on a house. She had deliberately structured the legal documents so my father could never touch the money. Now Derek was trying to leverage the absolute only thing she had given me to save his own skin from his reckless financial gambling. Worse than that, he was trying to do it using a predatory high-interest lender. I could see the logo of the lending company printed on the top corner of the paperwork, peeking out from the folder. They were notorious in the financial district for astronomical interest rates and brutal collection tactics. Derek was literally offering me up as a sacrificial lamb. If his firm defaulted on the payments, which they absolutely would given their current balance sheets, the bank would seize my entire inheritance and I would be left with nothing. "Let me get this straight," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral to hide the absolute rage building inside me. "You want me to co-sign a massive loan for a wealth management firm using my personal inheritance as collateral, a firm that I have absolutely zero stake in and a family that has ignored me for a decade." "Do not be selfish," Derek snapped, his remaining patience evaporating instantly. "You owe this family, Kira. Dad paid for your life for 18 years before you decided to throw a tantrum and drop out of school. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. You have been living in this rat hole doing absolutely nothing with your life, while Dad and I carry the heavy weight of the family legacy. This is your chance to finally contribute something meaningful." "What happens if the firm cannot pay back the loan, Derek?" I pressed, taking a step toward him. "What happens to my trust then?" "I just told you it is perfectly safe." He raised his voice, stepping closer to me. He was trying to use his height and physical presence to intimidate me. It was a bullying tactic he had used effectively since we were teenagers. "I am the one managing the firm investments. I know exactly what I am doing. I have an Ivy League Master of Business Administration. You do not even have a bachelor's degree. You do not understand how these high-level financial instruments work. Just sign the damn papers, Kira, so I can get back to Manhattan and do my job." I looked down at the folder again. I could clearly see the specific terms of the loan printed on the first page. The interest rate was aggressive. The repayment terms were impossible for a firm that was already failing. He was not just asking for a family favor. He was trying to drag me down with him on a rapidly sinking ship. I slowly reached out and picked up the leather folder. Derek exhaled a heavy, dramatic sigh of relief, clearly thinking he had won. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket to pull out an expensive gold fountain pen. Instead of opening the folder and signing my name, I handed it right back to him. I pressed the leather firmly against his chest, forcing him to take it. "No," I said quietly. Derek stared at the folder in his hands, and then stared at my face. His jaw dropped slightly in shock. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean absolutely not," I replied, stepping back and crossing my arms firmly. "I am not signing anything. I am not co-signing a predatory loan for a firm that has spent the last 10 years treating me like a complete failure. And I am certainly not risking the only thing Grandma left me to cover up whatever massive financial mess you have made." "You stupid little girl," Derek shouted, his face turning a deep, angry shade of crimson. The polished executive persona completely vanished, replaced entirely by the spoiled, vicious boy. "You have no idea what is at stake here. If we do not secure this funding today, the firm is going to fail the quarterly audit. We will lose our major institutional clients. Dad could lose everything he has built." "Then Dad should have hired a better investment manager," I said, calmly, letting my words cut through the air like a knife. "It sounds like his golden boy is not as brilliant as everyone thought. If your investments were solid, you would not be sweating in a cramped studio apartment in Queens, begging your dropout sister for her inheritance." The raw truth hit him hard. He stumbled back a step, gripping the leather folder so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He knew I was right. He knew his reckless amateur trades had dug a hole so deep that the entire firm was suffocating. But his massive ego would never allow him to admit failure. He pointed a shaking, angry finger directly at my face. "You are making a massive mistake, Kira," he threatened, his voice dropping to a dangerous, desperate whisper. "You think you can just say no to us? You think you can just hide in this miserable little box and ignore your family obligations? You are going to regret this. I promise you right now, I will make sure you regret this." "Get out of my apartment, Derek," I said, pointing a steady hand toward the door. "And take your garbage paperwork with you. I am not saving you." Derek glared at me with absolute pure hatred. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the apartment, slamming the heavy door so hard the walls shook. I stood alone in the quiet studio, listening to his heavy footsteps echo rapidly down the stairs. The first confrontation was over, and I had won. But I knew my brother well enough to know he would not just walk away. He was cornered, and a cornered animal was always unpredictable. I walked back over to my laptop and prepared for his next move. I sat back down at the wobbly desk and stared at the blank screen of my laptop. The silence in the small studio apartment was heavy, but it did not last long. I knew exactly how my family operated. They worked like a coordinated strike team whenever someone stepped out of line. Derek was likely sitting in his luxury car down on the street right now, frantically dialing our parents to report my disobedience. I rested my hands on the black keyboard of my laptop and waited patiently for their vicious retaliation to begin. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated violently against the cheap laminate surface of the small desk. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of incoming text messages. They were all from my mother, Susan. I picked up the device and watched the notifications stack one on top of the other. My mother typed out long paragraphs demanding to know what was wrong with me. She called me a stubborn and ungrateful child. She said I was intentionally trying to ruin my brother's life out of petty jealousy. According to her twisted narrative, Derek was making a tremendous sacrifice by taking time out of his busy schedule to visit me, and I had spat in his face. I scrolled through the messages with a sense of cold detachment. 10 years ago, those words would have crushed me. I would have desperately tried to explain my side of the story. But the woman sitting in this fake apartment was not the scared college dropout they thought she was. I did not type a single letter in response. I just watched the messages escalate from guilt trips to outright character assassination. She told me I was a profound disappointment to the family legacy. She ended her digital tirade by stating that my selfishness was exactly why I would always be alone and impoverished. The phone went quiet for a brief moment. Then it started ringing. The caller ID flashed with Derek's name. He was escalating to the next phase of their coordinated attack. I let it ring 3 times before answering. I did not say hello. I just held the phone to my ear and listened to his heavy breathing.
Did you read Mom's messages?
Derek demanded. His voice carried a sharp, venomous edge. He was trying to sound like a man who was completely in control. Because that is just the beginning, Kira. You really thought you could slam the door in my face and that would be the end of it? You think you are so smart, refusing to sign those loan papers. I think I made a financially sound decision, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Something you clearly struggle with. You have no idea how the real world works, Derek shot back, his voice dripping with condescension. You think you can just hoard that trust fund and live in your pathetic little bubble? But Dad and I are not going to let you sabotage this firm because of your petty grudges. If you will not voluntarily use your assets to help the family, then we are just going to take them. I frowned slightly and shook my head. You cannot touch Grandma's trust. The legal parameters are locked. The money can only be distributed to me directly for specific life events. You do not have the authorization to access those funds. A very harsh and cruel laugh echoed through the phone speaker. You really should have finished your education, Kira. Maybe then you would understand how wealth management actually operates. Dad is the executor of the overarching family estate. When Grandma passed away, she set up your trust under the umbrella of his primary holding accounts. It was meant to protect the money from your inevitable poor life choices. The money belongs to me, I stated firmly, though I knew exactly where this conversation was heading. I needed him to lay out his entire scheme. It belongs to you in theory, Derek corrected with sickening satisfaction. But Dad and I had our corporate lawyers review the original documentation this morning. There is a specific legal loophole regarding the management of dependent assets. Because you have no verifiable income, no property in your name, and a history of erratic behavior, Dad was miraculously able to successfully file an emergency legal motion of complete financial conservatorship over your specific trust. I gripped the edge of the desk. They had actually gone to a judge to declare me financially incompetent. They were willing to commit legal perjury to steal the few $100,000 my grandmother had left me just to save themselves.
The trust fund is officially frozen, Kira. Derek continued, his voice swelling with triumph. As of 2 hours ago, you cannot access a single penny of it. You cannot use it for school or a down payment. The bank has locked the account pending a full legal review, which Dad's lawyers will drag out for years.
That is blatant financial abuse, I said, playing the part of the desperate, cornered victim. You cannot freeze my money because I will not co-sign your terrible loans. That is completely illegal.
It is just business, Derek sneered. We are simply protecting family assets from a volatile beneficiary. But there is a very easy way to make this all go away. Dad is willing to drop the conservatorship motion tomorrow morning. All you have to do is come to the firm, sign the bridge loan documents, and pledge the trust as collateral, like a good, loyal daughter. We will even give you a small allowance to upgrade from that disgusting apartment. He paused, letting the weight of his threat settle over the line. He genuinely believed he had me completely trapped. In his mind, I was just a helpless pawn who had briefly tried to rebel before being violently forced back into submission. He thought he had stripped away my only safety net. You have no degree and no power, Derek said slowly, pronouncing every single word with deliberate malice. You do what we say, or you starve. Think about it, Kira. I will expect you at the office by 9 tomorrow morning. Do not be late. He ended the call before I could respond. The line went dead, leaving me in the quiet solitude of the staged apartment. I slowly lowered the phone and placed it directly on the center of the desk
next to the stack of fake utility bills. My family had just launched a coordinated legal and emotional assault designed to break my spirit and steal my inheritance. They manipulated the legal system to freeze what they believed was my only source of financial security. They were so incredibly arrogant. They were so blinded by their own sense of superiority that they never bothered to look beneath the surface. They simply assumed that my total silence over the past decade was an obvious sign of massive failure. They thought freezing a small trust fund would bring me to my knees. They assumed my lack of a traditional degree meant I was incapable of understanding how the world truly operated. I leaned back in the creaky wooden chair and let out a long, slow breath. The anger that had been simmering inside me for years suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. It was now a state of pure, absolute, cold focus. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial leverage and corporate dominance. They wanted to prove that power only belonged to those who ruthlessly manipulated the system to their advantage. I slowly opened a new encrypted browser window and prepared to initiate a sequence of events that would systematically destroy Harrison Wealth Management from the inside out. I did not feel starved. I did not feel powerless. I felt an overwhelming sense of anticipation. Derek had just given me the perfect justification to completely dismantle their entire existence. They wanted to see what happened when they pushed me into a corner. Right now, I was finally going to show them all. I did not open my personal banking page. That was the reaction Derek expected from a frightened woman who had just lost access to her only savings. Instead, I closed the fake utility spreadsheet on the screen and connected the laptop to Aegis through an encrypted executive channel. The cheap machine on the wobbly desk was only a shell. A biotic security key hidden beneath my sleeve unlocked a second operating environment, and the display changed instantly. The blank document disappeared. In its place rose the dark blue command dashboard of Aegis Financial Tech, filled with live credit positions, acquisition targets, and market exposure across 3 continents. Derek believed he had left me trapped inside a decaying studio with no money for groceries. In reality, I was looking at corporate liquidity greater than the combined assets of every guest who had laughed at me during my father's party. The frozen trust appeared in a separate report, temporarily restricted after an emergency petition. I cared because Grandma had created it for me, but I did not need it to survive. Derek had mistaken sentimental value for financial dependence. I entered Harrison Wealth Management into the acquisition search field. The system populated the screen with public filings, lender reports, commercial mortgages, equipment leases, credit facilities, and margin obligations. I authorized a full forensic profile. Red warnings appeared beside account after account. Several loans had reset at higher rates. 2 lenders had classified the company as high risk, and Derek's speculative portfolios were supported by dangerously thin collateral. The firm was not experiencing a temporary shortage. Its foundations had already cracked. The exposure map connected Harrison Wealth Management to regional banks, private credit funds, and distressed debt brokers. My father had divided the liabilities among institutions to prevent any single creditor from controlling him. That strategy worked only when no one possessed the capital to assemble the pieces. Aegis did. The most revealing item was the bridge loan Derek had tried to force me to secure. The lender had not yet funded it because my signature was missing. Without my trust as collateral, the proposed transaction was worthless. Derek had come to Queens believing he was asking for one small favor. What he had actually shown me was the precise moment his company would run out of oxygen. I downloaded the creditor schedule into a secure review folder and pressed the private call icon beside Felix's name. He answered before the second tone. "I assume the family meeting did not end with an apology," he said. "They filed an emergency petition to freeze Grandma's trust," I replied. "Derek believes it was my only financial resource. He gave me until 9 tomorrow morning to sign their bridge loan or starve.
There was a brief silence. When Felix spoke again, his voice was colder.
Our council can challenge the petition immediately. The supporting declaration appears to contain false statements about your income and capacity. Prepare the challenge, but do not file it tonight, I said. Preserve every document, every bank notice, and the recording of Derek's call. I want proof that the trust was frozen as retaliation for refusing the loan. But the trust is not the battlefield. It is the distraction they created for themselves. I shared the Harrison exposure map with him. Felix opened it on his end, and I watched his cursor move through the liabilities. He paused over the commercial mortgage, then the equipment facilities, then the margin accounts that were already flashing red. "This is worse than the preliminary report," he said. "They are over-leveraged and several creditors are preparing to sell their positions at a discount. If one party consolidated enough of this paper, that party could control every restructuring decision." I looked at the name of my father's company in the center of the screen. For years, Harrison had used money as a weapon. He had protected Derek after identity theft denied me education, and treated basic parental support as a debt I could never repay. Now his entire empire was dependent on contracts he assumed no one in the family could understand. "Felix, look up Harrison Wealth Management," I said. "Buy up their remaining debt from their creditors, all of it." Felix did not hesitate. "We can begin with the distressed positions before the market opens. The commercial lenders will require separate negotiations. To keep Aegis out of sight, I recommend using 3 acquisition vehicles and an independent servicing agent." "Do it legally and quietly," I instructed. "Use only creditor records, public filings, and formal due diligence. I do not want one transaction they can challenge. Move fast on lenders already seeking an exit. Once we control the majority position, do not contact Harrison or Derek until the last assignment is executed." "What level of control do you want?" "Enough to prevent them from refinancing around us. Acquire the real estate debt operating lines, equipment leases, and every transferable margin obligation. I want every escape route mapped before they realize a door has closed." Felix studied the screen. "The acquisition is within our reserve authority. The board's mandate allows distressed financial service assets. I can convene the committee and document the commercial rationale independently of your family connection." That mattered. I would not misuse my company for revenge. Harrison Wealth Management had valuable client accounts licenses and infrastructure beneath its incompetent leadership. Acquiring its debt was a legitimate opportunity. My family had supplied the timing. "Make the record clean," I said. "Disclose my relationship and recuse me from the pricing vote. You and legal counsel will approve the purchases on their financial merits." "Understood. And when the final creditor assignment closes," I watched a simulation build across the dashboard. One by one, the red liabilities changed ownership and converged beneath the Aegis acquisition vehicles. The model showed Harrison losing the ability to negotiate lenders against one another. It showed the margin calls accelerating, the commercial loan covenants tightening, and the board of his firm facing a choice between surrender and liquidation. "When the final assignment closes, we wait," I said. "No threats. No dramatic calls. We let their own contracts speak. They will search for emergency funding, but the frozen trust will not save them. Then, when they are desperate enough to approach the owner of their debt, we decide how much truth they are ready to see." Felix gave a quiet breath that sounded almost like approval. "I will activate the team now." The line disconnected. Almost immediately, status notifications appeared across the dashboard. Acquisition Counsel joined the workspace analysts, claimed creditor files, and a distressed debt specialist requested authority to approach the First Regional Bank. What had been a private insult was becoming a lawful corporate operation executed by professionals who respected evidence and process. I closed the report on Grandma's frozen trust and placed Derek's threat in a protected evidence folder. Then I changed back into my tailored jacket and looked around the staged apartment one last time. The cheap futon, empty food cartons, and overdue bills still presented the picture my family wanted to believe. I left every object exactly where it was. They might return, and I wanted their arrogance to remain undisturbed. When I stepped into the hallway, my private driver was already waiting at the curb below. I locked the apartment and descended the narrow stairs without looking back. Derek had driven away, believing he had reduced me to a starving dependent. By the time my town car crossed into Manhattan, Aegis had opened negotiations to purchase the first block of his company's debt. He had frozen a few $100,000 that belonged to me. I was quietly buying the machinery that controlled everything belonging to him. The debt market would now carry my answer back to the family that underestimated me. 2 weeks passed since Derek stormed out of that fake studio apartment in Queens. I did not spend that time sending angry text messages or engaging in their toxic family drama. I went back to my real life, in my Manhattan penthouse, and let my company do the talking. The hostile takeover of Harrison Wealth Management was a masterpiece of corporate strategy, executed flawlessly by Felix and our elite acquisitions team at Aegis Financial Tech. We did not just buy the specific bridge loan Derek was sweating over. We bought every single outstanding liability attached to my father's firm. We bought their commercial real estate mortgages. We bought their equipment leases. We even bought the highly leveraged margin accounts Derek had used to make his disastrous amateur trades. Within 14 days, Aegis Financial Tech legally held the paper for exactly 92% of my father's corporate debt. I had effectively become the silent owner of their entire existence. The true beauty of the trap was that my family had absolutely no idea who was actually tightening the noose. They only knew that their financial oxygen was being cut off at an alarming rate. I did not have to guess how they were reacting because their sheer panic was bleeding rapidly into the public sphere. High society in Connecticut is a remarkably small world, and rumors spread faster than a wildfire. Through my own network of industry contacts, I heard about the immediate and humiliating lifestyle adjustments my family was desperately trying to make just to free up cash. My mother, Susan, abruptly canceled the massive charity gala she had been planning for 6 months, citing a sudden desire for a quiet, private season. Everyone in her social circle knew that was a blatant lie to cover up a severe cash flow problem that was threatening to ruin them. But it was Courtney who provided the most entertaining display of financial distress. Derek's wife was a woman who defined her entire existence by zip codes and expensive designer labels. She had married my brother specifically for the Harrison wealth and prestige. When Derek was forced to cut off her limitless credit cards to hide his failing balance sheets from the auditors, she did not handle it with grace. My security team monitored public social media meltdowns and country club gossip to gauge their stress levels. According to the reports, Courtney threw an absolute fit in the main lobby of the Oak Ridge Country Club when her membership auto-renewal was declined for insufficient funds. She screamed at the poor front desk attendant, demanding to know why her platinum account was frozen. The club manager had to quietly escort her out of the building. She was completely humiliated in front of the exact same elite social circle my father had tried to impress at his retirement party. The irony was incredibly satisfying. While Courtney was mourning her lost country club privileges, my father and brother were facing a much darker reality inside the mahogany walls of their corporate office. The mandatory quarterly audit was looming closer every single day, and their bridge loan had been swallowed whole by a shadow entity they could not identify. Felix had intentionally structured the debt purchase through a complex series of blind trusts and holding companies. To Harrison and Derek, it just looked like a massive, faceless corporate conglomerate was systematically encircling them like a predator isolating its prey. They were scrambling to find alternative funding, but their credit rating was completely destroyed. No reputable bank would lend money to a firm with that much toxic debt on its books. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Derek's visit to Queens, Felix walked into my bright penthouse office and handed me a thick manila folder. He stood across from my glass desk with a calm, professional expression, but I could see the slight gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "The consolidation is fully complete, Madam Chief Executive Officer," Felix reported smoothly. "Harrison Wealth Management has officially missed 3 consecutive margin calls on their high-risk portfolios. They have breached the covenants on their primary commercial real estate loans. They are legally insolvent as of this morning." I opened the folder and reviewed the documents. It was a perfectly organized execution of corporate dominance. Every financial escape route for my father and brother had been methodically sealed off. "Have they attempted to contact the holding companies to restructure the debt?" I asked. "They have called our proxy representatives 14 times in the last 48 hours, Felix confirmed. "Derek is leaving increasingly desperate voicemails. He is offering aggressive equity stakes and begging for a 30-day extension. My team has maintained strict radio silence exactly as you requested. They are currently operating in a complete vacuum of information." "Good," I said softly, closing the folder. "It is time to turn out the lights. Authorize the final demand letter. Send it via certified courier directly to my father's desk." Felix nodded. "It will be delivered within the hour." The demand letter was a formal notice of immediate foreclosure on all corporate assets. The legal document stated clearly that unless the entire consolidated debt was settled in cash within 7 business days, the holding company would seize the firm, liquidate its assets, and terminate all executive contracts without severance. It was a financial death sentence. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling Manhattan skyline. I could only imagine the sheer terror that washed over my father when he opened that certified letter. He had spent his entire life building a company on a foundation of arrogance and superiority. He believed he was an untouchable titan of industry who could dictate the lives of everyone around him. Now he was staring at a piece of paper that told him he was about to lose everything he had ever worked for. He was about to be exposed as a massive failure to his clients, his ruthless competitors, and his demanding family. The empire he was so incredibly proud to hand over to his golden boy was crumbling into dust, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. He could not charm his way out of this crisis. He could not bully a subordinate to magically fix the balance sheets. He could not scream at me to make the problem disappear. He was entirely at the mercy of a corporate entity that did not care about the Harrison name or his country club reputation. For the first time in his entire life, my father was going to experience what it felt like to be completely powerless. He was going to feel the exact same crushing anxiety I felt when I was 19 years old, dealing with the collection agencies Derek had unleashed on me. He was going to feel the same suffocating despair I felt when he refused to co-sign my student loan and told me my ambitions were worthless garbage. The difference was that I had survived my rock bottom and used it to build an empire. My father and brother were too weak to survive theirs. They were men built on hollow prestige and stolen credit. I knew their next move before they even made it. Panic always breeds predictable behavior. When a ship starts sinking, the rats do not try to fix the holes, they just try to find a piece of driftwood to cling to. My father would never accept public ruin without exhausting every single personal connection he had left. He would turn to his family for a bailout, not realizing that the person he was about to beg for help was the exact same person holding the executioner's axe. I took a slow sip of my coffee and waited for my personal cell phone to ring. The real entertainment was just about to begin. The trap was perfectly set, and they were walking right into it, completely blind to the reality of the situation they had created for themselves. The screen of my cell phone lit up exactly 3 minutes later. The caller identification displayed a group conference call, initiated by my father. I let it ring 4 times before I finally pressed the answer button and put the call on speakerphone. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and rested my hands on my glass desk.
Kira!
My father's voice boomed through the speaker. He was trying to project his usual booming authority, but I could hear the faint tremor of exhaustion underneath his aggressive tone. "It is about time you answered. I expect you to prioritize family communications, especially during a crisis. Everyone else is already on the line." "I am here, Dad," I said, keeping my voice quiet and submissive. "What is going on?" "What is going on is that this family is under attack," my mother Susan interrupted immediately. Her voice was shrill and strained. "Your father and brother have been working themselves to the bone to protect our legacy, and we are facing a temporary cash flow issue. A very severe one." "It is a targeted financial assault," Derek chimed in. He sounded like he was pacing around a room. "Some nameless, faceless corporate vulture has been buying up our debt and trying to force an illegal foreclosure. It is completely unethical, but they have tied up our operating capital. We need to hire a top-tier team of corporate litigation attorneys by the end of the week to file an emergency injunction and block their hostile actions." I looked at the actual foreclosure documents sitting neatly in my manila folder. There was absolutely nothing illegal about what Aegis Financial Tech had done. We simply bought the debt he had recklessly created and called it in. "Lawyers are expensive," I pointed out softly, "which is exactly why we are having this mandatory family meeting," my father stated. His tone left absolutely no room for debate. "We are pooling all available family resources to defend the firm. I have already liquidated my personal stock portfolios. Derek is refinancing his secondary properties. We need you to do your part, Kira. We need you to immediately sell your car and completely drain whatever savings you have managed to scrape together from your little odd jobs. We need every available dollar transferred into the Family Legal Defense Fund by tomorrow afternoon." I stared at the phone in genuine disbelief. They had just frozen my grandmother's trust fund, leaving me with what they assumed was absolutely nothing. And now they were demanding I sell my personal vehicle and empty my meager savings to bail them out of a multi-million-dollar disaster? They literally wanted to strip me down to nothing. Before I could even formulate a response, Courtney joined the conversation. My sister-in-law sounded like she was on the verge of a hysterical breakdown. "You have to do this, Kira," Courtney pleaded, her voice cracking with dramatic entitlement. "You have absolutely no idea what we are going through right now. The country club suspended my platinum membership this morning. I had to cancel my charity luncheon. The valet at the restaurant downtown literally told me my card was declined in front of the entire zoning board committee. I was so completely humiliated I could not even breathe." "You are sitting in that cheap apartment with no real responsibilities, while my entire luxury lifestyle is being ripped away from me. You are being incredibly selfish if you do not give Dad the money to fix this." "Your lifestyle is not my responsibility, Courtney," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly calm. "And selling my used car is not going to cover the retainer for a team of corporate litigation attorneys. How much debt are we actually talking about here, Derek?" The line went dead silent for a few seconds. I knew they did not want to admit the actual numbers to me. "That is none of your concern," Derek snapped defensively. "You just need to send the cash. If you want me to hand over my life savings, I think I deserve to know the details," I pressed, leaning forward toward the speaker. "What kind of debt did this anonymous company buy? Are we talking about the commercial real estate mortgages or the high-risk margin accounts? Have they breached the loan covenants already? Because if they own 90% of the liabilities and you have missed 3 consecutive margin calls, a team of lawyers is not going to save you from a legal foreclosure. They have the right to seize the firm." The silence that followed my questions was deafening. I had just used the exact terminology that applied to their specific impending doom. I could practically see the blood draining from my brother's face. He was probably staring at his phone, wondering how a college dropout living in a dingy Queens apartment suddenly knew about commercial loan covenants and margin call breaches. "Where did you hear those words?" my father demanded. His voice was thick with sudden suspicion. "Who have you been talking to? Kira?" "I read things online, Dad," I lied smoothly. "I am just trying to understand the financial structuring of this crisis. If this holding company holds the paper on the firm, what is your actual exit strategy?"
"Enough!" my father shouted.
The panic in his voice was finally boiling over into pure explosive rage.
"I will not sit here and be interrogated by my uneducated failure of a daughter. You do not know the first thing about high-level corporate finance. You do not understand how these sophisticated markets operate, and I am not going to waste my valuable time explaining complex debt restructuring to someone who could not even manage to graduate with a basic business degree."
"I am just asking for a clear explanation," I said, letting a hint of fake desperation slip into my voice. "You want me to empty my bank accounts. I need to know the money will actually help." "You lack the intellectual capacity to grasp the situation," my father spat out viciously. "You have always lacked the drive and the intelligence to survive in this industry. This is exactly why you are a complete embarrassment to the Harrison name. We are not asking for your financial advice, Kira. We are demanding your financial obedience. You are going to transfer those funds, or you are going to be permanently cut off from this family." A sharp electronic beep echoed through the speaker. My father had literally muted my line. I was still on the conference call, but I could no longer speak. He had silenced me, just as he had silenced my ambitions and my opinions for my entire life. He needed total control, and he could not handle anyone questioning his authority, especially not the daughter he viewed as completely worthless. I sat back in my plush leather chair and rested my chin on my hands. I did not feel angry. I felt an overwhelming sense of vindication. I watched the active call timer ticking upward on my phone screen while my family continued to speak as if I were not even there. They were talking over each other, their voices frantic and uncoordinated. "She is completely useless," Courtney complained loudly. "I told you we should not even bother calling her. Her cheap little car is not going to save us anyway." "We need every dollar, Courtney," Derek snapped back, his voice cracking under the extreme pressure. "The liquid capital is entirely gone. We cannot even make payroll on Friday. The lawyers are demanding a massive retainer up front because they know our credit rating is garbage right now." "We do not need her money," my father interrupted. His tone was heavy with a new desperate strategy. "I have another plan. We are going to go directly to the source. This anonymous holding company is ruthless, but they are still businessmen. They want to make a profit. I am going to draft a direct acquisition pitch to the chief executive officer of their parent organization." I leaned closer to the phone, my eyes wide with intense amusement. He was actually going to do it. He was going to beg me for a buyout without knowing he was begging me. "Are you sure that is a good idea, Dad?" Derek asked, sounding incredibly hesitant. "They have refused to return any of our calls. They have completely frozen us out. Why would the chief executive officer of a massive conglomerate agree to meet with us when they already have us cornered?"
"Because I am Harrison," my father declared with arrogant delusion. "I have built 30 years of goodwill and prestige in this industry. When I sit down with this chief executive officer face to face, I will make them see the value of keeping our executive team in place. I will offer them a highly favorable acquisition deal that benefits both parties. We just need to get in the room with them. I am drafting the email right now. I will send it directly to their executive board."
I could not hold back a quiet laugh. The sheer arrogance of my father was truly astounding. He honestly believed his outdated charm and his country club reputation could sway the leader of a ruthless financial technology empire. He thought he could negotiate his way out of a fatal corporate trap by simply shaking hands and offering a few empty promises.
"Do it," my mother urged, her voice filled with blind faith in her husband.
"They would be incredibly foolish to turn down a meeting with you, Harrison. You can fix this. You always fix this." I reached out and ended the call on my phone. The voices of my desperate family cut off instantly, returning my penthouse office to a state of absolute peaceful silence. They were scrambling in the dark, completely unaware that the predator they were trying to negotiate with was the exact same daughter they had just muted and humiliated. I turned my attention to my secondary monitor. I opened my executive email client and waited patiently for my father's desperate pitch to arrive in my inbox. The screen of my secondary monitor lit up with a silent notification, piercing the quiet calm of my penthouse office. An email had just arrived in the secure inbox reserved exclusively for direct communications with the Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Financial Tech. I moved my hand to the wireless mouse and clicked the icon, watching the message expand across the high-definition display. The sender was listed as the Office of the Chief Executive at Harrison Wealth Management.
My father had not wasted a single second. The panic from the conference call had propelled him straight to his keyboard, just as I knew it would.
I read through the text slowly, savoring every single carefully crafted word. My father had clearly poured all of his remaining pride into this desperate pitch. He started the email by heavily padding his own resume, reminding the anonymous reader of his 30 years of supposed excellence in the Connecticut financial sector. He listed awards he had won a decade ago and dropped the names of several prominent politicians he played golf with at the Oak Ridge Country Club. He used bloated corporate words like synergy and mutual strategic growth to mask the undeniable fact that his firm was completely bleeding out from every single artery. He proposed a face-to-face meeting at our earliest convenience to discuss a highly lucrative partnership that would secure Aegis a prominent foothold in the traditional wealth management space. It was a masterclass in corporate delusion. He was offering to sell a rapidly sinking ship while acting like he was handing over a luxury cruise liner. He entirely glossed over the missed margin calls and the breached loan covenants, pretending that the aggressive debt acquisition by Aegis was merely a clever business maneuver that he deeply respected. He ended the email by stating that he and his top executive, meaning my brother Derek, were ready to travel to Manhattan immediately to finalize the details of a mutually beneficial integration. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and let out a quiet, genuine laugh. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the man was breathtaking. He genuinely believed that his outdated charm and his country club reputation could override the cold, hard mathematics of his massive insolvency. He thought he could sit across a boardroom table from a ruthless corporate titan and dictate the terms of his own financial rescue. He was a man who had never been told no in his entire life, and he was operating under the assumption that the world would always bend to his will. I placed my hands on my keyboard and began to type my official response. I did not use my own name. I replied from the General Executive Administration account, maintaining the heavy veil of corporate anonymity that had terrified them for the past 2 weeks. I kept the message incredibly brief and entirely devoid of any emotion. I wrote that the Executive Board of Aegis Financial Tech had reviewed the preliminary proposal and was willing to grant a single 30-minute acquisition meeting. I set the date for the following Monday at 9 o'clock in the morning at our primary headquarters in downtown Manhattan. I instructed them to bring all relevant proprietary assets and justify a buyout of this magnitude. I added a final sentence stating that the Chief Executive Officer would be in attendance to personally evaluate their presentation. I read over the short email one last time, ensuring the tone was perfectly sterile and intimidating. Then I moved the cursor over the send button and clicked it. I watched the message vanish into cyberspace, knowing it would land in my father's inbox like a divine intervention. He would see that response and believe he had just secured the salvation of his entire family legacy. He would view it as a total victory. I turned away from the monitor and picked up my personal cell phone from the glass desk. The group conference call had long since ended, but the family group chat was still active with panicked messages from Courtney and my mother complaining about their frozen credit cards. I ignored the group thread and opened a direct message conversation with my father. I stared at the blank text box for a moment, thinking about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, and the cruel ultimatum he had delivered just an hour ago. I typed out a very specific message. "Do not worry, Dad. I am sure the Chief Executive Officer of Aegis will give you exactly what you deserve." I hit send and watched the tiny green delivery confirmation checkmark appear at the bottom of the screen. Less than a minute later, the 3 gray typing dots appeared on my display. My father was responding. He was likely sitting at his heavy mahogany desk, reading my message with intense irritation. His reply came through fast and dripping with his familiar contempt. "Keep your sarcastic comments to yourself, Kira. We just secured a meeting with the head of the holding company for Monday morning. While you are sitting in your miserable apartment doing absolutely nothing, I am going to save this family. Do not contact me again until you are ready to transfer the money we demanded." I smiled at the glowing screen of my phone. He had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. He assumed my text was just the bitter whining of an uneducated daughter who was deeply jealous of his high-level business maneuvers. He read the words "exactly what you deserve" and interpreted them as petty sarcasm from someone who had failed at life. He had absolutely no idea that I had just personally sent him the meeting invitation he was currently celebrating. He thought Monday was going to be the day he saved his empire. He did not realize it was going to be the day of his absolute corporate execution. I locked my phone and set it back down on the desk. The transition into the weekend was going to be an agonizing period of preparation for them. They had exactly 3 days to put together a pitch that would convince a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate not to liquidate them instantly. My email had explicitly demanded that they bring proprietary assets and intellectual property to justify the buyout. I knew exactly what that requirement would do to them. It would expose their greatest weakness. Harrison Wealth Management was an absolute dinosaur. They did not have proprietary algorithms or innovative financial technology. They relied entirely on outdated models and personal relationships that were rapidly losing value in the modern market. Derek was supposed to be their brilliant financial genius, but his recent trades had proven he was nothing more than an impulsive amateur, gambling with other people's money. When they sat down to build their presentation this weekend, they were going to realize they had absolutely nothing unique to offer. They were bringing a knife to a gunfight, and they were going to start panicking all over again. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the windows, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the busy city streets below. The game was entering its final and most crucial stage. Derek was a man who cornered easily, and when he felt trapped, he always looked for a shortcut. He would never walk into that boardroom empty-handed, but he lacked the intellect to create something valuable on his own. He was going to look for something to steal. He was going to try and find a cheat code to impress the executives at Aegis. And I knew exactly where his desperate mind was going to take him. The pressure of the weekend was going to push him right over the edge. He had always taken the easy way out, relying on the hard work of others to prop up his own inflated ego. This time would be absolutely no different. He would search for a lifeline, a piece of technology that could bridge the massive gap between his failure and our standards. He was about to make the most catastrophic decision of his entire life, and I would be waiting for him. The trap was ready. Let the weekend begin. Friday passed with a tense silence that hung heavily over my penthouse. I spent the day reviewing the final acquisition documents with Felix, ensuring that every legal mechanism was locked firmly into place. I knew my brother was scrambling through the sprawling corridors of our parents' house, desperately searching for anything that could save his crumbling reputation. He had always been a man who took the path of least resistance. When faced with the insurmountable task of proving his own intellectual worth, he would inevitably look for something to steal. I knew he would eventually find his way to the one room in that house he had always despised: my childhood bedroom. I had left a few boxes of old belongings there when my father kicked me out, assuming they would eventually throw them away in the garbage. They never did. They just locked the door and pretended the room did not exist. Saturday morning arrived with a heavy blanket of gray clouds rolling over the Manhattan skyline. I was sitting at my kitchen island, drinking black coffee, when my personal cell phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed Derek's name. The moment of truth had finally arrived. He was calling to gloat. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting my heart rate settle into a steady rhythm. I needed to play my role perfectly. I pressed the answer button and raised the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. "I hope you are sitting down in that pathetic little apartment of yours, Kira," Derek said. His voice was breathless and practically vibrating with an adrenaline-fueled arrogance. He sounded like a man who had just struck gold. "Because I just found the exact thing that is going to save Harrison Wealth Management. And the best part is that I found it sitting right under your nose gathering dust." "What are you talking about, Derek?" I asked, keeping my voice flat and cautious. I injected a hint of anxiety into my tone, making it seem like I was genuinely worried about what he was going to say next. "I am standing in your old bedroom right now," he announced with a cruel laugh. "You really left this place a complete mess when you stormed out all those years ago. Mom never even bothered to clean it out. I was looking through your old desk drawers because I figured you might have left some banking documents I could use. But I found something so much better. I found that dusty old silver external hard drive you used to obsess over." I gripped the edge of the kitchen island. I allowed my breathing to become heavier, making sure the microphone on my phone picked up the sound of my distress. "You have absolutely no right to be in my room, Derek. Put that hard drive back where you found it, right now. That does not belong to you." "It belongs to the family," he shot back, immediately his tone dismissive and aggressive. "I plugged it into my laptop to see what kind of garbage you were wasting your time on back then. I actually had to have one of the junior tech guys from the firm bypass your amateur password protection. Do you remember that predictive financial algorithm you were building when you were 19? The one Dad called worthless garbage before he told you to drop out of school? Well, it turns out it is actually a highly advanced piece of financial technology. My tech guy said the foundational code is brilliant. He said it could revolutionize predictive market analysis if it was properly funded." "Because it is brilliant," I said, letting genuine anger seep into my voice. "I spent 2 years writing that code. It is an extremely complex predictive model. You do not even understand the basic mathematics behind how it functions. Take it out of your computer and put it back in the desk, Derek. You are crossing a massive legal line." Derek laughed again, a loud, booming sound that echoed through the phone. He was intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. "I am not crossing any lines, Kira. I am salvaging family assets. You left this hard drive in our parents' house. It has been sitting here abandoned for years. I am taking this code and I am going to present it to the executive board of Aegis Financial Tech on Monday morning. When the chief executive officer sees this proprietary algorithm, they will beg to buy us out. This is the exact intellectual property we need to secure a massive valuation. This code is going to make me a multi-millionaire." "You cannot do that," I protested, raising my voice to convey a sense of panic. "That algorithm is mine. I wrote every single line of that code. If you try to present that to Aegis as your own creation, I will call their corporate office and tell them you stole it. I will hire a lawyer and I will sue you for intellectual property theft. I will ruin the entire acquisition." "You will do nothing," Derek snarled.
The playful arrogance vanished from his voice, replaced by a cold, ruthless threat. You think you can sue me, Kira? With what money? We froze your trust fund. You cannot afford to buy groceries right now, let alone hire a team of intellectual property lawyers to fight me. But even if you somehow managed to find a desperate lawyer to take your pathetic case, you would lose instantly. It is my code, I insisted, sounding breathless and desperate. It is corporate property, Derek corrected, his voice dripping with venom. Dad and I had our legal team draft the preliminary paperwork an hour ago. You wrote that code while you were living under our parents' roof. You ate food paid for by the family firm. You used a laptop that Dad bought for your 18th birthday, and you transmitted the data using the secure internet network paid for by Harrison Wealth Management. Under state law that makes your little project a direct product of family resources. If you try to claim ownership, we will file a massive lawsuit against you for attempting to steal assets. We will bury you in so much legal debt, you will never see the light of day. You know that is a lie, I pleaded, letting my voice crack slightly. You know Dad told me it was worthless. You cannot just take my work and slap your name on it to save your failing company. I am acting as the primary developer for Harrison Wealth Management, he mocked. I am taking something that was sitting in a dusty drawer and turning it into pure gold. You are just a college dropout, Kira. You would not know what to do with an advanced algorithm anyway. You lack the business acumen to monetize it, and you lack the corporate connections to pitch it. You would have just let it rot in this miserable bedroom forever. I am doing the world a favor by taking it out of your incompetent hands. Please, Derek, I said, letting a quiet sob slip through my lips. It was the performance of a lifetime. Please do not do this. It is the only thing I have left that I actually created in my entire life. Grow up, Kira, he snapped callously. This is how the real world works. The strong take what they need to survive, and the weak get pushed aside. You chose to be weak when you walked out on this family. Now you get to sit in your disgusting little studio apartment and watch me save the family legacy using the very thing you abandoned. Do yourself a favor and stay out of my way. If you try to interfere with the Aegis meeting on Monday, I will make sure Dad presses federal charges against you for corporate theft. Enjoy the rest of your miserable weekend. The line went dead with a click. I slowly pulled the phone far away from my ear and smiled to myself. The silence in my penthouse felt incredibly heavy, but it was the kind of weight that anchored you after a long storm. I placed my cell phone gently onto the cool granite surface of the kitchen island. I did not scream in anger or throw anything against the wall. I simply closed my eyes and let the profound reality of what had just transpired wash over me. Derek had taken the bait with a level of enthusiasm that bordered on absolute desperation. He had practically sprinted into the trap, completely blinded by his massive ego and his desperate need for validation. I knew his character flaws intimately, and I knew that when faced with the terrifying prospect of sitting across from the executive board without a single valuable asset to offer, he would inevitably revert to his most basic instincts. He would steal. I walked over to the espresso machine and began brewing a fresh cup of coffee. As the dark liquid poured into my ceramic mug, I thought back to the lonely summer I had spent writing that specific algorithm. I had been 21 years old and eager to prove my worth to a family that viewed me as a genetic disappointment. I locked myself in that stifling childhood bedroom for weeks, fueled by cheap energy drinks and pure, stubborn determination. I wrote thousands of lines of complex code, building a predictive model that could analyze market volatility with unprecedented accuracy. When I presented it to my father, I was shaking with excitement, genuinely believing it was my ticket to earning his respect. Instead, he glanced at the screen for 30 seconds before laughing in my face. He called it a worthless academic exercise and demanded I focus on finding a wealthy husband.
The profound irony of the current situation was almost too rich to fully comprehend. The exact piece of technology my father had dismissed as garbage was now the very lifeline his golden boy son was clinging to in order to save their dying empire. Derek truly believed he could walk into my corporate headquarters, plug that dusty silver hard drive into a presentation monitor, and dazzle my executive team with his stolen genius. He was operating under the arrogant assumption that because I was just his college dropout sister, I lacked the foresight to protect my intellectual property. He assumed the code was a raw, unprotected file sitting abandoned on a forgotten drive. I picked up my mug and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling Manhattan skyline. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee, letting the bitter taste ground me. It was time to finalize the execution. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my secure corporate phone. I bypassed the biometric locks and dialed the direct private extension for Felix. The line did not even ring twice before my chief operating officer answered. "Good afternoon, Madam Chief Executive Officer," Felix said, his voice perfectly measured and calm as always. "I trust your weekend is proceeding exactly according to your established schedule." "It is proceeding better than I could have anticipated, Felix," I replied, keeping my tone professional but allowing a faint trace of satisfaction to color my words. "I just received a highly entertaining phone call from my older brother. He informed me that he was currently standing inside my childhood bedroom. He has officially taken possession of the external hard drive we discussed." "Excellent news," Felix noted. I could hear the faint sound of him typing on a mechanical keyboard in the background. Did he express any hesitation regarding the origin or the ownership of the files? "Absolutely none," I said, taking another sip of coffee. "In fact, he boldly proclaimed that the intellectual property legally belongs to Harrison Wealth Management. He threatened to bury me in a massive lawsuit if I attempted to claim ownership. He explicitly stated his intention to present the algorithm to our executive board on Monday morning as his own proprietary creation." The sound of typing stopped completely. When Felix spoke again, there was a distinct edge of predatory amusement in his typically sterile voice. "He actually intends to present it as his own original intellectual property. He is going to claim authorship." "He was extremely clear on that specific point," I confirmed. "He believes it is going to make him a multi-millionaire. He thinks it is the exact leverage they need to survive the insolvency." "Then he has officially crossed the threshold from desperate corporate maneuvering into the realm of severe federal crimes," Felix stated matter-of-factly. "I will immediately notify our internal legal counsel and our corporate security director to make the necessary preparations. Ensure that the boardroom is equipped with our highest resolution recording equipment," I instructed. "I want every single word of his presentation captured with flawless audio and video clarity. We need absolute, indisputable documentation of him claiming ownership of the code before the entire acquisition committee. We will let him complete his entire pitch without interruption." "Of course," Felix agreed. "And regarding the digital architecture of the files on that specific hard drive, I assume the security measures remain intact?" "They are permanently embedded," I assured him. "Derek believes he had a junior tech employee bypass my password protection. He thinks he cracked the vault. What his amateur IT guy actually did was simply unlock the outer viewing shell. The foundational architecture of that predictive algorithm is woven with a highly advanced encrypted digital watermark. That watermark cannot be altered, removed, or deleted without completely destroying the functional integrity of the entire software." "And the registration?" Felix asked. "The watermark is federally registered to a private limited liability company that I established in Delaware exactly 10 years ago," I explained. "That holding company is the sole legal owner of the intellectual property. Aegis Financial Tech subsequently licenses the underlying framework of that code directly from my holding company for a sum of $8 million annually. It is a core component of our current market analysis infrastructure. So your brother is not simply attempting to steal a forgotten college project, Felix summarized smoothly. He is preparing to walk into the corporate headquarters of Aegis Financial Tech and attempt to sell us stolen intellectual property that we already actively license from a highly secure holding company. Furthermore, he is intending to commit this blatant act of corporate espionage and federal fraud while actively soliciting a financial buyout. Exactly. I smiled. The sheer magnitude of the legal trap was breathtaking. When Derek plugs that hard drive into our presentation system on Monday morning, our security network will instantly recognize the encrypted watermark. The system will automatically log the unauthorized deployment of the code. By the time he finishes his arrogant little speech, he will have provided us with a documented, recorded, and indisputable confession to federal corporate fraud. It is a flawless strategy, Felix noted. I will have our legal team draft the preliminary injunctions and the federal fraud reporting documents this afternoon. We will have them ready to file the moment the meeting concludes. How would you like to handle your personal attendance at this presentation? I will not be in the room initially, I decided. I want them to feel completely comfortable. Let them build their massive house of cards right there on the boardroom table. Once Derek has fully committed to the lie and his presentation is complete, you will officially introduce the Chief Executive Officer. Understood perfectly, Felix said. I look forward to seeing their reactions. Enjoy your weekend, Felix, I said softly. The trap was now securely locked. My brother thought he had just found his ultimate salvation. He had actually found his total ruin. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, unrelenting brightness that washed over the towering glass and steel canyons of downtown Manhattan. The headquarters of Aegis Financial Tech occupied the top 3 floors of a premier skyscraper, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable power. From my private office, I watched the live security feed on my secondary monitor. The high-definition cameras captured my father and brother stepping out of the private executive elevator and into the expansive marble-floored reception lobby. They were exactly on time, driven by a desperation that was palpable even through a silent video feed. My father, Harrison, wore his finest charcoal pinstripe suit, a bespoke garment he usually reserved for his most critical client acquisitions. Yet despite the meticulous tailoring, he looked physically diminished. He was gripping his leather briefcase so tightly that his knuckles were stark white against his aging skin. Beside him, my brother Derek looked even worse. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his eyes darting frantically around the sleek, minimalist lobby. He wore a navy suit that suddenly looked slightly too large for him, perhaps due to the weight he had undoubtedly lost over the grueling, panic-filled weekend. Tucked securely under his left arm, pressed tightly against his ribs, was the sleek leather portfolio containing my stolen silver hard drive. He was clinging to my intellectual property as if it were a life preserver in a raging ocean, completely unaware that it was actually the anchor that was about to drag him straight to the bottom. I watched as my executive assistant approached them with a practiced, sterile smile. She verified their identities and led them down the long glass-walled corridor toward our primary presentation boardroom. The boardroom was an architectural masterpiece designed specifically for high-stakes intimidation. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying, unobstructed view of the sprawling city below. A massive polished obsidian table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by 20 ergonomic leather chairs. It was cold, modern, and entirely devoid of the stuffy, wood-paneled traditionalism that characterized Harrison Wealth Management. As they were escorted inside, the security cameras provided a flawless view of their reactions. My father walked to the head of the table, but hesitated, correctly assuming that the seat of power was reserved for the chief executive officer of Aegis. Instead, he chose a seat near the middle, carefully placing his briefcase on the polished obsidian surface. Derek sat immediately beside him, placing his leather portfolio on the table with exaggerated care. The assistant offered them water, which they both accepted with tight, strained nods before leaving them alone in the massive room. The moment the heavy double doors clicked shut, the facade of corporate composure immediately cracked. The high-resolution microphones embedded in the boardroom ceiling picked up every single labored breath and frantic whisper. "Did you see the lobby?" Derek hissed, wiping a fine sheen of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "This place is a fortress, Dad. They occupy 3 entire floors in one of the most expensive commercial buildings in the world. We are completely out of our league here." "Keep your voice down," my father snapped, though his own voice trembled slightly. "We are Harrison Wealth Management. We have a legacy. We have 30 years of established prestige. This holding company might have capital, but they lack our traditional market roots. That is exactly what we are going to leverage." "They do not care about our legacy." Derek shot back, his panic rising rapidly. He tapped the leather portfolio containing the stolen hard drive. "This is the only thing that matters. We have to lead with the proprietary algorithm. We have to convince them that we are an innovative technology firm masquerading as a traditional wealth manager. If the chief executive officer does not buy the technology angle instantly, they are going to liquidate us by Friday. I will handle the introductions and the overarching strategic vision," my father instructed, smoothing his tie with shaking hands. "When I give you the signal, you boot up the presentation and you walk them through the code. You project absolute confidence, Derek. You own that intellectual property. You created it. Do not let them see a single drop of hesitation." I sat back in my office chair listening to their pathetic rehearsal. They were psyching themselves up, building a fragile house of cards out of stolen assets and delusional arrogance. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the steady rhythm of my heart ground me. The time for observation was officially over. It was time for execution. I stood up and smoothed the front of my suit. I had chosen my wardrobe for this morning with absolute precision. I wore a custom-tailored, stark, white designer power suit that commanded attention and projected unyielding authority. The cut was sharp and modern, paired with a simple silk emerald blouse and classic black stilettos. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style that left no room for softness. I did not look like the daughter who had been kicked out of her childhood home. I did not look like the scapegoat who had been deemed uneducated and worthless. I looked exactly like the apex predator of a multi-billion-dollar financial empire. I stepped out of my office and walked deliberately down the long, glass corridor. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, a steady, measured drumbeat that echoed through the quiet executive wing. As I approached the heavy double doors of the primary boardroom, I paused for a fraction of a second. I let go of every lingering trace of familial obligation. I erased the frightened 19-year-old girl who had desperately sought her father's approval. I embraced the cold, calculating reality of the present. I pushed the heavy double doors open, stepping into the expansive boardroom with purposeful strides. The sound of the doors opening caused both my father and brother to flinch physically. They jumped in their seats, their heads snapping toward the entrance, expecting to see a towering, intimidating billionaire titan of industry, ready to decide their ultimate fate. Instead, they saw me. The silence that crashed down over the room was absolute and suffocating. My father stared at me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending, as if an apparition had just materialized in front of him. Derek's mouth fell open, his gaze darting from my sharp white suit to the sleek leather portfolio resting on the table in front of him. For 5 agonizing seconds, neither of them moved a single muscle. Their brains were desperately trying to process the impossibility of my presence in this specific room at this specific time. Finally, my father's ingrained arrogance overrode his shock. The confusion in his eyes morphed instantly into explosive, indignant fury. He stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the floor. He assumed the only reality his narrow mind could comprehend. He assumed I was a menial employee here.
Kira, my father hissed, a venomous, strained whisper. What are you doing here? I continued walking calmly toward the head of the obsidian table, keeping my expression perfectly blank. Good morning, Harrison. Good morning, Derek. I trust your journey from Connecticut was smooth. Are you out of your mind? My father demanded, marching toward me. He kept his voice low, terrified of being overheard by the executives he assumed were waiting outside. How did you get into this building? Are you a receptionist? Do you fetch the coffee? You need to leave this room right this second, Derek chimed in, finding his voice as panic seized him. He threw his body over the leather portfolio. Dad, we cannot have her here. The chief executive officer is going to walk through those doors any minute. If they see her, they will think we brought an incompetent relative to embarrass us. Get right out. I did not flinch or run. Instead, I pulled out the head chair and sat down, facing them both. I rested my forearms on the boardroom table and crossed my legs, settling perfectly into the head chair. Derek was the first to react to my blatant defiance. He vaulted out of his seat, lunging forward with his hands planted flat against the polished stone. His face was a deep shade of crimson, and panic sweat visibly dripped down his temples. He looked frantically toward the heavy double door, terrified that the billionaire executive was standing outside listening to this disastrous reunion. He lowered his voice to an aggressive, strained whisper, demanding that I get up and walk out immediately. He told me I was going to ruin the only chance this family had left to survive. He pointed a trembling finger at the door and commanded me to go back to the lobby before I destroyed everything. I did not move a single muscle. I looked at him with an expression of profound boredom. My calm demeanor only infuriated him further. He took a step toward me, his hands clenching into tight fists. He called me a pathetic, jealous failure who had tracked them down just to sabotage their success out of pure spite. He claimed I was unstable and threatened to call security to have me dragged out onto the street. My father finally found his voice, breaking through his initial paralysis. Harrison stood up, slowly adjusting his expensive pinstripe suit, with hands that were visibly shaking. He tried to project the commanding patriarchal authority he had weaponized against me for my entire life, but the illusion was crumbling rapidly. His voice lacked its usual booming resonance. It sounded thin and hollow, echoing weakly in the massive room. He told Derek to calm down and handle himself like a professional. Then he turned his cold, disapproving gaze on me. He spoke to me as if I were a particularly slow child who had wandered into a restricted area. He informed me that Aegis Financial Tech was a multi-billion-dollar holding company and that the people who ran this building did not tolerate security breaches. He assumed I had conned my way past the front desk, perhaps, claiming I was a delivery person or a junior assistant. He ordered me to stand up, apologize, and exit the premises immediately before he was forced to involve local law enforcement. He reminded me that Harrison Wealth Management was minutes away from securing a massive buyout, and my behavior was putting millions at risk. He told me I was an embarrassment to the family name, and my presence here was absolute proof of my worthlessness. I let him finish his speech without offering a single word of interruption. I sat there watching them unravel under the crushing pressure of their delusional arrogance. I looked at the sleek leather portfolio resting on the table directly in front of Derek. The portfolio containing the stolen silver hard drive, the stolen algorithm that would serve as the final nail in their corporate coffin.
I asked them calmly if they honestly believed a dusty college project was going to impress the executive board. I asked Derek if he truly felt capable of defending the mathematics of a predictive model he did not even understand. Derek slammed his hand down hard on top of the leather portfolio, protecting his stolen treasure. He sneered, calling me a bitter dropout who could not stand the fact that he was about to monetize my discarded garbage. He confidently declared that he had spent the weekend mastering the concepts and was going to walk out of this room as a wealthy man. He told me I would be lucky if he ever tossed a few spare dollars my way when I ended up on the streets. He leaned over the table, glaring at me with absolute contempt, and told me my time was up. Just as Derek opened his mouth to hurl another insult, the heavy double doors of the boardroom clicked open. The sound cut through the tense atmosphere like a gunshot. Harrison and Derek snapped to attention instantly, transforming from abusive relatives into sycophantic corporate salesmen. They frantically smoothed their ties, adjusted their suit jackets, and plastered eager smiles across their sweating faces. They completely ignored me, focusing all their desperate energy on the man entering the room. Felix walked through the doorway with the precision and confidence that made him the most feared chief operating officer in the financial sector. He wore a flawless, tailored charcoal suit and carried a thick, leather-bound portfolio tucked neatly under his left arm. His expression was a mask of cold, professional detachment. He did not look like a man preparing to negotiate. He looked like an executioner arriving to fulfill a grim obligation. He closed the double doors behind him with a solid thud that seemed to seal the room shut permanently. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Harrison immediately stepped forward, blocking Felix's path to the head of the table. My father extended his right hand, offering his most practiced country club smile. He introduced himself loudly, proudly declaring that he was the chief executive of Harrison Wealth Management and that he was deeply honored to be invited to this prestigious headquarters. Felix did not break his stride. He did not slow down. He did not acknowledge the introduction, and he certainly did not reach out to take my father's outstretched hand. He simply continued walking, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. He walked right past my father, leaving Harrison standing there with his hands suspended awkwardly in the empty air. The practiced smile on my father's face shattered instantly, replaced by a look of profound confusion and rising panic. Derek scrambled to his feet, holding his leather portfolio tightly to his chest, as if it could somehow shield him from the terrifying coldness radiating from Felix. Derek stammered out a greeting, attempting to introduce himself as the primary developer of the revolutionary technology they had brought to present. Felix ignored him completely. He did not even turn his head to look at my brother. The complete dismissal was devastating. It was a level of disrespect that neither of them had ever experienced in their entire privileged lives. They were used to being the most important men in the room, and now they were being treated as if they did not even exist. They watched in stunned, terrified silence as Felix bypassed them entirely and walked straight toward the head of the obsidian table. Felix stopped directly to my right side. He turned to face me, and the cold mask of professional detachment melted away, replaced by an expression of deep, absolute respect. He did not look at my father or my brother, who were now staring at us with eyes wide open in total shock. Felix bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound deference that he reserved only for the ultimate authority in the building. He carefully placed the thick, leather-bound financial portfolio down on the table, sliding it precisely in front of me. He opened the cover, revealing a stack of meticulously drafted legal contracts. Then he spoke the words that would echo in their nightmares for the rest of their miserable lives. His voice was crystal clear, echoing through the silent boardroom. "The acquisition papers are ready for your signature, Madam Chief Executive Officer." The oxygen was instantly sucked out of the massive room. I looked past Felix and watched the color drain completely and entirely from my father's face, leaving his skin a sickly, ghostly gray. Harrison's jaw dropped open, his breath catching in his throat as the impossible reality crashed down upon him. Derek took a staggering step backward, bumping into his heavy leather chair as his legs threatened to give out completely. The leather portfolio slipped from his trembling hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The uneducated daughter they had thrown away and mocked was the billionaire holding their entire existence in her hand. The crushing silence in the boardroom stretched into an eternity. I sat perfectly still at the head of the obsidian table and watched the profound realization dismantle my father piece by piece. Harrison had always been a man of imposing physical presence, a titan of his own small world who ruled through intimidation and a booming voice. Now that voice was entirely gone. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a soft, breathless stammer escaped his lips. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff in the dark, waiting for a bottom that would never come. His hands, which had previously rested with such arrogant confidence on the polished stone surface, now trembled violently. He slowly lowered himself back into his heavy leather chair, as if the strength in his legs had simply evaporated. The charcoal pinstripe suit that had looked so sharp and commanding just 20 minutes ago suddenly seemed entirely too large for his shrinking frame. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, desperately searching my face for any sign that this was a cruel prank. He looked toward Felix, begging for a correction, for someone to laugh and point out the real chief executive officer. But Felix stood silently at my side, a perfect statue of professional deference. There was no mistake. There was no prank. I was the architect of their impending ruin, and my father was finally starting to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation. While Harrison was paralyzed by the shock, Derek reacted like a cornered animal. His mind simply rejected the impossible truth standing right in front of him. He could not process the fact that his discarded younger sister was the titan who had systematically dismantled the Harrison wealth management empire. The deep crimson flush of his face drained away, leaving him with a sickly pallor. He looked wildly around the room, as if expecting the walls themselves to offer an explanation. When he finally found his voice, it was high-pitched and thick with absolute panic. He began speaking rapidly, his words stumbling over one another in a frantic rush. He claimed there had to be a misunderstanding about the leadership structure. He insisted that I could not possibly be the founder of Aegis Financial Tech because I was just a college dropout who knew nothing about corporate finance. He pointed a shaking finger at Felix, demanding that the chief operating officer explain what was actually happening. Felix did not even blink. He merely offered a cold, dismissive stare that confirmed everything. Derek realized that blustering and demanding would not save him this time. The realization triggered a massive shift in his demeanor. The arrogant, bullying older brother vanished completely. In his place emerged a desperate, sweating salesman who knew he was seconds away from losing everything he had ever valued. Derek lunged forward and grabbed his leather portfolio from the table. His hands were shaking so badly that he fumbled with the zipper twice before finally ripping it open. He pulled out his sleek silver laptop and practically slammed it onto the obsidian surface. He was panting heavily, a fine sheen of sweat coating his forehead and upper lip. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes and attempted to pivot his entire strategy. If I was the billionaire chief executive officer, then I was the one he had to impress. He completely ignored the fact that he had just spent the last 10 minutes insulting me and threatening to call building security. He flipped the laptop open and frantically typed in his password. He grabbed the HDMI cable and jammed it into his computer. He told me that he had brought something incredible to show the acquisition team. He said that regardless of our past family disagreements, business was ultimately about securing valuable assets. His voice took on a manic, breathless quality as he described the predictive financial algorithm he was preparing to present. He called it a revolutionary piece of software that would change the way market volatility was analyzed. He claimed that he had spent the entire weekend refining the code, making it absolutely perfect for integration into the Aegis platform. He promised that this specific intellectual property would make both of our companies billions of dollars. I did not say a single word. I simply rested my hands calmly on the table and watched my brother dig his own federal grave. It was a spectacular display of reckless arrogance and profound stupidity. He reached into his pocket and produced the stolen silver hard drive, the exact drive he had taken from my childhood bedroom just 2 days ago. He held it up like a trophy, believing it was his ultimate salvation. He plugged the drive into his laptop and navigated through the folders. He was speaking so fast now that spit was flying from his lips. He pitched the algorithm as his own proprietary creation, a stroke of genius that he had developed from scratch to save his father's firm. He assured me that Harrison Wealth Management held the exclusive intellectual property rights, and that transferring those rights to Aegis would be a seamless process. Every word out of his mouth was a documented lie. Every claim of ownership was a recorded confession to corporate fraud. The high-resolution cameras in the ceiling captured his face perfectly, and the sensitive microphones picked up every desperate syllable. My father remained completely silent beside him, staring blankly ahead, as if his mind had simply shut down. He offered no support and no intervention, leaving Derek to spin his web of deceit alone. Derek finally double-clicked the execution file on the hard drive. He turned his laptop screen toward me, expecting to see a raw string of numbers and variables that he could pretend to understand. He took a deep breath and prepared to launch into the technical portion of his stolen presentation. He waited for the projection system to mirror his screen onto the main boardroom display. But nothing happened. The massive wall monitor remained completely dark. Derek tapped his keyboard frantically, muttering under his breath about technical difficulties. He unplugged the cable and plugged it back in, but the screen remained stubbornly black. I let him struggle for another full minute, watching the panic rise in his chest until he was practically hyperventilating. Then I slowly reached into the pocket of my white suit jacket. I pulled out a remote control that synced directly with the central security architecture of the building. I leveled my gaze at Derek, locking eyes with him across the long expanse of polished stone. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of emotion. I simply pressed the solitary silver button in the center of the remote. The lights in the boardroom instantly dimmed by 50%, casting long shadows across the table. Behind me, the massive wall projector hummed to life with a quiet mechanical purr. The screen illuminated the room. But the projector was not displaying Derek's laptop screen. It was displaying the internal security audit of the file he had just attempted to open. The massive screen showcased thousands of lines of complex foundation code, but right in the center, glowing in bold crimson letters, was an unremovable, encrypted digital watermark. Below the watermark, a series of highly classified registration documents appeared. The screen displayed the official federal copyright registration, the original development timestamp from 12 years ago, the LLC registration from 10 years ago, and the commercial build timestamp from 7 years ago, and the registered owner of the intellectual property. The unmistakable text read, "Sole property of Kira, founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Financial Tech." The silence in the room was absolute. My brother stared at the massive projection, his mouth hanging open in sheer terror. The game was over. Checkmate. The crimson letters glowed against the massive screen, casting a harsh light over the polished obsidian table. Derek stood perfectly still, his hands hovering above the keyboard of his silver laptop, as if the machine had just electrocuted him. His eyes darted frantically back and forth, reading my name and my title over and over again, unable to force his brain to accept the undeniable reality. The arrogant smirk that had defined his features for his entire life simply dissolved, leaving behind a pale mask of absolute terror. He looked small and pathetic standing there, stripped of his unearned confidence. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and suffocating, broken only by the quiet hum of the projection equipment overhead. Neither my father nor my brother dared to breathe. They were trapped inside a nightmare of their own making, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their monumental miscalculation. Harrison was the first to break the heavy spell. His heavy leather chair creaked loudly against the polished floor as he leaned forward. The commanding patriarchal authority he had weaponized for decades vanished instantly. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut. His face shifted into a bizarre expression of forced warmth that made my stomach turn. He tried to smile, but his lips trembled violently, betraying his absolute panic. He cleared his throat twice before speaking, his voice lacking all of its usual booming resonance. It sounded incredibly thin and hollow, echoing weakly across the massive boardroom. He forced out a breathless laugh, as if this entire scenario was just a delightful family misunderstanding. He reached his shaking hands out toward me, across the dark obsidian surface, his palms facing upward in a pathetic gesture of surrender and desperate pleading. "Right here, right now," he called my name with a sickeningly sweet tone that he had never once used on me during my entire childhood. He told me that I had played a brilliant practical joke on them and praised my spectacular business acumen. He claimed he had always known I was destined for greatness from the very beginning. His words were so blatantly dishonest, they practically dripped with poison. He pleaded with me to remember that we were family, and that family always protects each other no matter what happens. He offered to make me a full senior partner at Harrison Wealth Management, promising that we could merge our incredible empires together. He painted a ridiculous picture of the three of us running the financial sector as an unstoppable family dynasty. Then he pulled his final manipulative card, telling me that my mother Susan missed me desperately every single day, without fail. Unbelievable. While Harrison was attempting to construct this pathetic fantasy of family unity, Derek was physically falling apart right next to him. The realization of what he had actually done finally penetrated his dense skull. He had walked into a heavily monitored corporate facility, holding stolen intellectual property, and explicitly confessed to federal corporate fraud on camera. The massive projector screen behind me served as a glowing crimson reminder of his impending incarceration. He staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he was experiencing a massive heart attack. His breath came in ragged, pathetic gasps, and thick tears began to pour down his sweaty cheeks. He completely ignored our father and lunged toward the table, falling to his knees right on the polished marble floor. He gripped the edge of the obsidian surface with white knuckles, begging me for mercy with a voice that was high-pitched and totally, completely broken. He told me that if Aegis Financial Tech pressed charges and forced Harrison Wealth Management into bankruptcy, his entire world would end today. He wailed that his beautiful wife Courtney would absolutely leave him if the money disappeared. He painted himself as the ultimate victim, claiming he only stole the algorithm because the immense pressure to save the failing family business had temporarily driven him completely insane. He promised he would do absolutely anything I wanted if I just turned off the recording equipment and deleted the security logs. He offered to publicly kneel before me and apologize for every single horrible thing he had ever said to me. He literally groveled on the floor of my boardroom, a grown man weeping uncontrollably, terrified of facing the actual consequences of his lifelong arrogance. The golden child was entirely broken, begging the uneducated sister to save his pathetic, miserable, useless life. I remained entirely stone-faced, sitting perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair. I did not blink. I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy or comfort. I just stared at them, with eyes that felt like solid ice. Felix stood silently by my side, acting as the perfect professional witness to their ultimate humiliation. He kept his hands clasped behind his back, his face an impassive mask of corporate detachment. I let Derek cry on the floor for a full, agonizing minute, letting the profound silence of the room amplify his pathetic sobbing. I wanted them to feel the absolute crushing weight of their total failure. I wanted them to experience the exact same suffocating helplessness that they had gleefully inflicted on me for my entire childhood. When I finally decided to speak, my voice was dangerously calm, echoing softly across the dark stone boardroom table surface. I addressed my father first, looking straight into his wide, terrified eyes. I told Harrison that his sudden, profound dedication to family unity was incredibly fascinating, considering his historical behavior. I asked him where this deep, fatherly love had been during my entire life, when he actively treated me like a genetic disappointment. I reminded him that just a few minutes ago he had threatened to call the police on me, simply because I dared to sit in this room. I methodically broke down every single instance where he had chosen his massive, fragile ego over his own daughter. I reminded him of the countless times he praised Derek for mediocre accomplishments while entirely ignoring my exceptional academic success. I told him that Susan did not miss me because she had never actually bothered to know the real me. She had only loved the obedient, quiet version she desperately wanted. Harrison tried to interrupt me, his hands shaking wildly as he stammered out pathetic excuses about generational differences and tough love. I silenced him instantly by raising one perfectly manicured finger. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished stone table, locking my absolute, unyielding gaze onto his crumbling face. I transported us back to that humiliating evening at his lavish retirement party. I repeated his exact words, the ones that had scarred my soul, back to him with flawless precision. I reminded him how he stood in front of his wealthy colleagues, holding his expensive crystal scotch glass, and loudly mocked my life choices. "Failures do not belong here," you had proudly declared to the entire room, banishing me from the family legacy. The words hung in the sterile boardroom air, echoing like a brutal physical strike against his face. He shrank back into his heavy chair, trembling. Harrison weakly pounded his fist against the table, trying desperately to regain some semblance of control over the spiraling disaster. He begged me to think about our poor beloved grandmother and the sacred family trust fund. He whined that freezing the Grand Family Trust had already caused them unimaginable financial hardship and intense social humiliation. He claimed I was destroying our glorious, prestigious ancestral legacy over a petty, forgotten, youthful misunderstanding. That specific comment was the absolute final nail in his deeply buried coffin. The sheer delusional audacity required to call decades of systematic psychological abuse a minor youthful misunderstanding was utterly staggering. I slowly stood up from my executive chair, towering over his shrinking, pathetic form. I smoothed the pristine front of my sharp white suit and looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated corporate dominance. I was ready to deliver the ultimate crushing, killing strike. I leaned in incredibly close so he could hear every single deliberate syllable I spoke. I informed him that the grandmother's trust fund he was crying about was nothing but absolute literal pennies compared to the massive corporate wealth I was about to seize. I explained that the trust account was merely a tiny, negligible fraction of the financial pain I had meticulously orchestrated for them. While they were busy whining about a frozen inheritance, I was systematically dismantling the foundational infrastructure of their entire holding company. I told Harrison that my legal team had already filed the necessary extensive paperwork to strip him of all his remaining commercial assets. The trust fund was simply a very convenient initial distraction to keep his arrogant eyes completely off my broader, aggressive acquisitions. He had foolishly mistaken a tiny strategic paper cut for the massive, impending, fatal corporate decapitation stroke approaching quickly. My father stared at me as the magnitude of his total ruin finally penetrated his thick skull. The revelation that I had systematically dismantled his financial legacy while he was distracted by a minor trust fund dispute left him completely paralyzed. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a suffocating fish. He looked down at his trembling hands tracing the lines of his aging skin, and then looked back up at the glowing crimson projector screen that displayed his son's undeniable federal crimes. The booming patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist for 3 decades was gone, replaced entirely by a broken, terrified old man who suddenly understood that he was completely outmatched. Derek remained on his knees on the cold marble floor, weeping softly into his hands, incapable of processing the reality of his own destruction. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for either of them. I felt nothing but the cold, absolute clarity of final justice. I gave a subtle, measured nod to Felix, who had been standing silently by my side like a perfectly tailored sentinel. Felix stepped forward with fluid grace and opened the thick leather portfolio he had carried into the room. He produced 2 stark white document folders and placed them directly in the center of the dark obsidian table. He slid them precisely across the polished stone until they rested right in front of my father's shaking hands. I leaned back in my high-backed leather executive chair and steepled my fingers together. I told Harrison to pay close attention because I was only going to explain the terms of his surrender one time. I gestured smoothly toward the first folder on the left side of the table. I explained that the thick stack of legal papers inside was a finalized corporate acquisition contract. Aegis Financial Tech was offering to purchase the entirety of Harrison Wealth Management, including all physical assets, client portfolios, proprietary data, and remaining capital. However, the purchase price I was offering was humiliatingly low. It was a fraction of what his beloved firm was supposedly worth just last week. I watched my father's eyes widen in horror as I verbally listed the proposed purchase price, a number so insultingly small that it barely covered the outstanding debts he owed to his creditors. I calmly informed him that under the specific terms of this aggressive buyout, his prestigious position as chief executive officer was permanently terminated, effective immediately. Furthermore, the massive golden parachute and luxurious retirement package he had spent years selfishly securing for himself were completely liquidated. He would walk away from the company he built with absolutely nothing. Then I turned my attention to the golden child kneeling on the floor. I told Derek that the acquisition contract included a specific personnel clause drafted entirely for his benefit. As of the moment those papers were signed, his employment was terminated with extreme prejudice. He would receive 0 severance pay, 0 extended health benefits, and 0 positive references for any future employment endeavors. He was being cast out into the corporate wasteland with a permanent mark of severe incompetence and suspected fraud attached to his professional record forever. Derek let out a pathetic sob at the news of his unceremonious termination, but he did not dare look up at me to protest. My father reached out with a trembling hand and rested his fingertips on the first folder, treating the paper as if it were a live explosive device. Before he could open the cover to review the disastrous financial terms, I instructed him to look at the second folder, resting quietly on the polished stone. I explained that the second document was an ironclad, legally binding non-disclosure and no-contact agreement. The terms were absolute, unforgiving, and carried catastrophic financial penalties for any attempted violation. By signing that specific document, Harrison and Derek were legally forfeiting any right to ever speak about me, my company, or the details of this humiliating acquisition to anyone in the world. They were permanently banned from contacting the financial press, discussing me with their wealthy country club associates, or mentioning my name to any mutual acquaintances. But the restrictions went far beyond professional silence. I leaned slightly forward, looked directly into my father's defeated eyes, and delivered the final, permanent boundary. The strict no-contact order extended to every single member of the immediate family, including my mother Susan. They were explicitly forbidden from calling my personal or business phone numbers, sending me emails, mailing letters, or attempting to approach me in any public setting. They were legally required to pretend that I simply did not exist. I was severing the toxic bloodline, forever excising them from my reality with clinical precision. Harrison finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged whisper scratching its way out of his dry throat. He looked at the two folders resting on the dark table, and then looked up at me, with eyes filled with crushing defeat. He stammered frantically that the terms were barbaric, complaining bitterly that I was leaving them with nothing but the expensive suits on their backs. He begged me to reconsider the brutal offer, whining that the buyout price was practically criminal and would leave him bankrupt and destitute in his old age. He asked me how I could possibly be so ruthless and cruel to my own flesh and blood. I leaned forward again, resting my forearms flat on the table, and let the ice in my veins radiate through my steady voice. I told him that he had exactly 60 seconds to pick up the silver pen resting next to the folders and sign every single signature line presented to him. If he refused, or if he attempted to negotiate a single word of the contracts, the generous offer would be permanently rescinded. I pointed up at the massive projector screen, still brightly displaying Derek's stolen digital signature and the encrypted federal timestamps. I calmly informed them both that my corporate legal team had already completed a formal criminal referral package for the appropriate federal authorities. If those contracts were not signed within 1 minute, Felix was authorized to transmit the recorded presentation, the stolen drive audit, and the ownership records, while our counsel filed emergency civil claims to preserve every relevant asset. Derek would then face a real investigation for attempted corporate fraud and intellectual property theft, and Harrison would be exposed to the same scrutiny if the evidence showed that he had approved the scheme. I could not promise them an instant arrest, but I could promise that once the evidence left this room, neither influence nor family reputation would bring it back. The terrifying threat of immediate federal prison broke whatever fragment of resistance remained inside their shattered egos. Derek scrambled up from the floor, his face slick with sweat, and grabbed my father's arm. He begged Harrison to sign the papers without hesitation, sobbing wildly that he could not survive a single day in a federal prison cell. He pleaded with his father to sacrifice the company to save him from criminal prosecution and absolute ruin. Harrison looked at his golden child, the son he had blindly placed on a pedestal, and finally saw him for the cowardly thief he truly was. With a heavy, defeated sigh that seemed to drain the very last ounce of pride from his aging body, my father slowly picked up the heavy silver pen. His hand shook violently as he opened the first folder and scrawled his signature across the bottom of the acquisition contract, officially signing away his lifelong empire for literal pennies. He then moved mechanically to the second folder and signed the strict no-contact agreement, legally erasing himself and my mother from my life forever. Derek snatched the silver pen from his father's hand and eagerly signed his own humiliating termination and non-disclosure forms, weeping loudly with sheer relief. Felix stepped forward seamlessly, collecting the signed documents and returning them to his leather portfolio with practiced efficiency. I pressed a sleek button on the intercom embedded in the surface of the obsidian table. 2 massive security guards immediately entered the boardroom. I instructed them coldly to escort the 2 former executives out of the building. Harrison and Derek gathered their empty leather briefcases with shaking hands. They did not say a single word as the security guards marched them out of the room, entirely stripped of their wealth, their company, and their toxic pride. The double doors closed softly behind them, sealing the massive boardroom in profound quiet. Felix offered me a respectful nod before quietly exiting to process the signed contracts. I stood up slowly and walked with measured steps toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning sun cast a warm golden glow over the sprawling canyons of downtown Manhattan. I placed my hands against the cool glass and took a deep, cleansing breath. I was not bitter, nor was I angry anymore. I felt free, surrounded by the empire I built and colleagues who truly respect me. The story of Kira teaches us a profound lesson about self-worth, resilience, and the true meaning of family. For years, Kira was cast as the family scapegoat. She was mocked, dismissed, and discarded by the very people who were supposed to protect and uplift her. Her father and brother defined success through a narrow, arrogant lens, confusing cruelty with strength and entitlement with genuine merit. They looked at Kira and saw only what their egos wanted to see. But Kira's journey reminds us that our value is never dictated by the toxic narratives others project onto us. Instead of allowing their emotional abuse to break her spirit, she channeled her pain into quiet, unstoppable ambition. She did not fight them with loud arguments or desperate pleas for validation. She fought them with undeniable, spectacular results. She built a massive corporate empire in the shadows, relying entirely on her intellect, her relentless work ethic, and her unshakable belief in her own potential. The ultimate justice in this narrative is not simply about financial ruin or corporate maneuvering. It is about reclaiming your own power. It proves that the most devastating response to a lifetime of underestimation is absolute success. Kira found her permanent freedom not just in taking back her family's firm, but in the realization that she no longer needed their approval to exist. Share your experiences in the comments below about a time you were underestimated by those closest to you, and how you found the strength to rewrite your own story. If Kira's journey to absolute freedom resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more empowering stories of reclaiming your worth, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that their greatest success is still ahead of them.